This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Mirus, and as usual, I'm here with my co-host James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hey, Thomas. Hello, everyone.
And we're doing something a little bit different today. Most of our episodes are focused on just one particular film, and today we're going to have a more general conversation about cinema because we've got a very, very special guest with us. Many of you may know him, Bishop Erik Varden. He is the Bishop of Trondheim, Norway, and a Trappist monk. He recently preached the Lenten retreat for Pope Leo and the Roman Curia, and he's the author of several books, including most recently Towards Dawn, Essays in Hopefulness, as well as The Shattering of Loneliness, and a book on chastity, which I interviewed him about on the Catholic Culture podcast a while back. Your Excellency, Bishop Varden, thank you so much for coming on our show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I was thinking of having you on because you've mentioned films at various times in your books and in your lecture on translation that you gave for First Things recently in New York. You always have these very erudite film references, and I thought it would be worth sort of digging into that. And so just to sort of get our bearings, because we don't know very much about your general background with this art form, could you say a few words about your sort of general background and your relationship with the art of cinema, and maybe sort of some of your tastes or any formative experiences you might have had with that art?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm aware that for some it might seem a contradiction to introduce someone as a Trappist monk and as a lover of the cinema. But I think the two can coexist. I was born in 1974, so I grew up with a television at home and a cinema not too far away. So films were just part of daily life. But I think I experienced cinema when I was growing up as entertainment. One went to watch suspenseful films or funny films, entertaining films, romantic films. And my awakening to the cinema as art happened at a precise moment when I was at secondary school in Wales. And it happened in my Russian class, because we had a very good Russian teacher from Bulgaria who was interested in cinema. So she put a cinema module on our syllabus. So we watched a number of classics of Russian cinema. And among those films was Andrei Tarkovsky's film Sacrifice.
Wow.
And I'd just never seen anything like it. And to realize just the density and purity of expression and the poetic depth and the intelligence of that film, which I've since watched many, many times, that caused a sort of revolution in me. And I realized, goodness, there is more here than I'd ever realized. And that got me sort of hooked. So that when I went on to go to university, my friends used to say that it was always very convenient because they knew where to find me during the day. If I wasn't in the university library, I'd be at the cinema.
Wow, that's fantastic. And so this was in secondary school, obviously before your discovery of your vocation as a religious, as a Trappist. Has your being a Trappist informed your perspective on the cinema or your way of viewing cinema since then?
Yes, not least because the years I spent in the monastery were, to a large extent, years of cinematographical fasting.
Yes.
As a community, we would watch a few films in Eastertide and in Christmastide as part of just a recreational week, but we wouldn't watch much. And I had a sort of a counter experience when I joined the monastery. And one of the things that happens when you join the monastery is that you find yourself cut off from lots of stimuli that outside surround you all the time. And when you don't have that constant exposure to the radio, television, films, whatever, that feels very peaceful for a while, a couple of weeks or so. And then you realize just what's going on in your interior cinema in terms of the stuff you remember. And during those months, even years, I came to realize just how powerful visual impressions are. And I remembered scenes from films that I wished I didn't remember. I remembered some beautiful things, but I also remembered ugly things, scenes of violence, scenes of death, those sort of scenes that are just an ordinary matter of course, really, part of any action film. But I realized that those things that I hadn't really noticed, or might even have found objectionable when I watched them, had lodged themselves in my memory. And so I realized then that one has to be cautious about what one watches, because it doesn't just go into the great interior recycling bucket. It stays there, and at some point you have to deal with it. So that's made me discerning with regard to what I watch.
Well, that's very interesting because on this podcast, we've had occasion to speak a fair amount about issues with depiction of sexuality or nudity in film, and tried to sort of like do a moral and aesthetic analysis of how that all functions. One thing that we've been sort of wanting to get into but haven't quite felt we had the wherewithal to think about properly is the issue of violence, because typically when the church makes comments about cinema, I can think of, statements, short addresses by John Paul II on the topic, for instance, on various occasions. When they warn about kinds of images that can be degrading, they usually warn about sex and violence together, even though on the surface, at least to many Americans, they seem like very different types of depictions. So, when you're seeing a naked body on screen, it really is a naked body, whereas the violence is completely simulated, for instance. So we were curious to ask you a bit more about this, the depiction of violence on screen, because that seems like maybe a subtler question in some ways, or harder to sort of get a handle on the morality of it and sort of the effect that it might have on the viewer. Maybe to earlier ages it wouldn't have seemed so difficult, but we're desensitized to it now. But do you have any more thoughts on that as a sort of a moral issue?
Well, I think you've really touched the raw nerve there, and I think the most important thing is just not to get into a position where we just take it for granted and accept it uncritically. And I think a first stage is having the sort of realization that my particular circumstances enabled me to have, that in fact such images aren't indifferent. They do make an impact on the memory, on your sensibility, and thereby potentially on your way of relating to the world, to other people. Because as you said, Thomas, when we watch violent content over time, we're desensitized to it, and what we're desensitized to in the virtual world or the world of fantasy may come to be a desensitized issue also in real life. And so we may find ourselves adopting violent ways, be it simply in the way we speak to people. I think it is also good to ask ourselves what it is about us that takes pleasure and finds excitement in the depiction of violence. Obviously, I mean, that's an excitement which is as old as humanity. When we read that the old Roman emperors distracted the people with bread and circuses, I mean, those weren't circuses just with clowns.
Right.
They were basically scenes of enacted violence that we read about in many of the lives of the martyrs. And that if we turn the lens round and put the camera, as it were, on ourselves, we may have to ask, well, where's the violence within me that finds a kind of satisfaction in seeing it acted out on the screen?
Right, and not just action, but violence per se. Like because there's a distinction there. It seems with the enjoyment of action, the enjoyment of the depiction of a contest of some kind, right? Of a battle, of a struggle of some kind, is distinct from the thrill of seeing sort of violence done to a human body, for instance, yes. Right?
And then there's also, I think, a distinction in delight in the violence itself, as would happen in perhaps like an action movie, versus delight in precisely the aversion to the violence or the anticipation of the violence, as would happen in a horror film, for instance, So I don't know if in the final analysis that makes so much of a difference with regards to the impact upon the imagination or sort of how these images live inside of us. But do you think that it does sort of, color the interaction with the image differently if you, in turning the lens to yourself, are recognizing these different modes of engaging with violence?
I think it can do, and even when violence is used ironically, or is employed in film as a kind of a symbol of something. I mean, I think of a film like Pulp Fiction, that I mean, it's one of the rare occasions when I've left a film halfway through, because I normally tend to sit them out. But I just found I couldn't take it.
I see,
And I couldn't understand afterwards how friends of mine could have gone to see it and found it entertaining. I still haven't worked that out.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Tarantino has a very kind of particular relationship to violence, and it seems to be one that, ultimately trivializes it.
No, but I in some ways, that's what I found most objectionable.
Yeah.
And quite shocking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, you're a very classically educated person, and I may be misremembering this, but I seem to remember hearing that the word obscene itself comes from like the Greek theater, and that it refers to things that would be done, things that would not be depicted on stage. In other words, things that would happen implicitly off stage, and that this included as much as anything sort of like sexually obscene, because they might have even indeed have had such things on stage at certain points. So we know that from the church fathers and such. But it included violence, like the scene of Clytemnestra putting her not Clytemnestra, who's Oedipus's wife, putting her eyes out, is not depicted on stage in Oedipus Rex, for instance. So there is an interesting question there of like how we view the human body, that the human body, and perhaps this sort of connects to that the disgust that people in various times have had for vivisection or for doctors who dissect corpses, right? That the human body is simply not meant to be seen in a certain state, right? We're not supposed to see what is on the inside of the human body coming out of it, so to speak. Yep. So I don't know if that brings up any further thoughts, Bishop, but...
No, I think it's an extremely relevant comment, and the etymology is entirely correct, I think, and it's... And the fact... But the fact that something can happen off stage and we can still feel the impact of it viscerally stimulates a kind of perception in us, and a subtlety of perception which is lost when everything becomes explicit, and that I think is a problem with much of contemporary media content, which is just vulgar.
And
that it makes us. It's a kind of obfuscation that makes us then deaf and blind to hints, to allusions, to subtle references, and thereby leaves us a bit stunted, really, which isn't a happy lot.
Right.
Yeah, well, so speaking of theater and Greek theater, we already mentioned the church's caution with depictions of violence and sex. But on the whole, the church has seemingly been very encouraging to cinema and to filmmakers, especially in the past century. Well, I guess cinema hasn't been around all that long, but this is very different from the church's traditional attitude toward theater and toward the actor, which very early on was quite hostile. And in fact, I remember reading somewhere that actors used to have to disavow their career upon being baptized and brought into the church.
And this was true in the age of Molière as well, just a few hundred years ago
really?
in France. Actors were excommunicated automatically.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So do you have any familiarity with this legacy of hostility, or at least suspicion from the church toward theater? And do you have any thoughts about what may account for this shift or a seeming difference in the way that cinema is treated?
But I think the bias in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and even into early modernity was to do with the fact that the actor's profession was connected with immorality, so that an actor was somehow a loose person, someone who was not dependable, and who dealt shadily. And there were even, one finds that in the literature, associations of, actresses in particularly as associated with prostitutes, and that was probably true at given times in history, but it was a label that stuck.
Right.
Obviously, that shifts over time, and with the, I think of think of Marcel Proust and his great novel. À la recherche du temps perdu, the status of the actress in that work in the late 19th, early 20th century, the actress has become this sublime being who is, the narrator in the novel ascertains this through the goings-on at his uncle's house, his uncle being someone who has connections in the world of the theatre. But the theatre is emerging as a vehicle of sublimity. And I think some of that was gradually transferred into the cinema. And I think from the church's point of view, there has been this awareness that cinema has a side which is potentially banal, uninteresting, even grotesque, but that, on the other hand, has this capacity to render very high content. And I think, the fact that people could see literally from quite early on just how powerful the moving image was.
Yeah,
made the church also see that this is a medium that could potentially be extremely valuable in the communication of the good news.
Well, that leads me to a question about the unique qualities of cinema as opposed to other storytelling art forms. So we've had this discussion a lot because part of the reason for this podcast is to introduce Catholics to the great diversity of what cinema can be, which includes just great, straightforward storytelling, as in, the classic golden age of Hollywood mode. Plenty of great films from that era, of course. You mentioned Casablanca, I think, in your recent First Things lecture, and that's a great example. But I think a lot of people, and certainly in the church, when people are talking about how to use cinema to glorify God, think of it simply as it's a way of delivering stories, and it's a sort of a popular means of telling a story, and that's part of it, but that's not all of it. It doesn't tell us what distinguishes cinema from theater or from the novel in a sort of a deeper formal sense, other than the fact that it's sort of delivered on a screen. So, given your love of many art forms, music and literature and cinema, do you have any thoughts on kind of what the deeper, distinctive vision or the truth that cinema in particular is able to capture or express in a way distinct from, say, a literary approach? I mean, you mentioned the sacrifice being this formative experience, and that's obviously very different from, Casablanca. So,
obviously, there's an extremely close and necessary link between the cinema and the theatre, and to a certain extent, the cinema is a privatized form of theatre, and an easily and a mobile form of theatre. I think that even the way we watch films has changed, even just in the last 10 years, because people still go to the cinema, but increasingly now, films have become something that we have brought into our homes, that we stream or we watch on DVDs, or people make their own home cinemas. And the fact that the experience is privatized and brought into the home, brought into my living environment, makes it extremely intimate and impactful. And that too, I think, is something that invites reflection. Just what precisely do I want in my living room? I went to the cinema last year and watched what's the title of it? The film about the director of Auschwitz, The Zone of
Interest?
Yes, that's right. It was a devastating film, extraordinary and very, very powerful. I went with in fact, two of the priests from the parish. We watched it. We left the cinema in silence, and at the end of the road, where normally we would have said, "Shall we go and have a beer?" We just sort of nodded to one another and said goodnight.
Wow.
And it was so necessary to have that space between the cinema and my home. That's not a film I would wish to watch at home.
Wow.
And I think that's one of the particularities of cinema, that it has that immediate impact that I can, particularly now when we have that consciousness, I could purchase this and I could watch it again. I could put it in my pocket. I could make it my own. It makes it almost unbearably close and intimate at times.
What do you think about the relationship between cinema and contemplation, and how it's different from either literature or theater?
Or other visual art forms, for that matter.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, potentially the cinema can be a huge distraction to contemplation, because it fills your mind with images that crop up when you would like your vision to be focused on the supernatural and the timeless and the eternally true, good, and beautiful. At the same time, I think the cinema can potentially help us to see. Tarkovsky is a great example of that. I think Kieślowski is another director who is a great example of that. There are certain scenes in his films that remain within you as a kind of blessing, because he's enabled you to see something in a new way, and to lift up your gaze and to lift up your heart. I think we just need to exercise a lot of careful discernment there, and, as I said earlier on, not to be neglectful of the fact that negative imagery will also leave its mark and will need to be dealt with somehow.
Yeah. Before we move on any further, I want to stay with this comparison and contrasting with theater for just a moment, because hearing you talk about this privatization of theater, but also this experience of going to the cinema with a couple of brother priests, it's making me think that one of the seeming essential differences between the theater and cinema is this aliveness, this live quality that accrues to theater, this sort of de facto community that emerges every time theater takes place. Whether, the community of the cast that's putting on the play, but also the audience that has gathered to see it. And that cinema can be something that I engage in purely from a solitary mode, by myself at home. So, do you have any thoughts about if we just focus on cinema for a moment, the relative strengths of these two different ways of engaging in cinema, by myself or with others? And when I view cinema with others, does it approach the same level of social communion with others as would happen in my experience of the theater?
I think the theatre is different because it is live, and because there is a sort of a transaction going on, and the people on the stage are giving you something, and at the end they appear and expect to be thanked for it. Then you applaud them, and the applause itself marks a boundary. It formalizes an act that says, now we cut. The performance is finished. Now we're back in real life. That doesn't happen in the cinema. I mean, it's very rare that people clap at the end of a film. And when you watch a film on your own, obviously that line is not there at all. And you might be left with a sense that the film has sort of entered you in a way.
It's very interesting. I've had this experience with film, certainly, what you're describing.
And that can be wonderful, but also quite uncanny and on occasion scary.
Yeah,
because somebody else's imaginative world comes to inhabit you.
Yeah, no, this is something that I hadn't actually thought about before, because I tend to be more interested in theater.
He's a theater actor.
Yes, I'm a theater artist myself. And I have this kind of bias against film for being a dead letter, essentially. That there's no life here, that this was capturing something that was at one moment alive, but now is a kind of simulacrum, and so its capacity to be a part of my life is thereby diminished. But this is a very interesting thought of its ability to get under the skin and stay with you. I mean, it seems like the credits rolling is almost kind of like a ritual of this detachment. I need to see these credits rolling. I need to read the names of the people who performed these roles, be brought back gradually to real life. I need the music to send me out. And it's one of the reasons why I feel so offended with streaming platforms today that will so often immediately rush you into another film. The countdown timer begins and you have to frantically try to click it to stop so that you can just sit with this movie for a moment. But yeah, this is an angle that I'd never really quite considered before.
Bishop Varden, I want to talk a bit about Catholic cinema. There's a lot of discussion right now about trying to have some kind of, I don't know if revival is the right word, because I don't know that there's ever been a sort of there have been great Catholic films, but I don't know that there's ever been like a stable, like sort of community of Catholic cinema or Catholic filmmakers over the decades. But there's a discussion about what makes for a Catholic film And in particular, a particular genre, like what makes a good saint film? Because many of the Catholic films that people try to make are saint films. We've seen some many poor examples of this, but also some very good ones. The Flowers of Saint Francis, A Hidden Life, a wonderful recent American example, which came out last year, Triumph of the Heart. I don't know if you got a chance to see that, but it's a wonderful film about Saint Maximilian Kolbe. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the challenges, the unique challenges of the saint film or Catholic cinema in general, the question of how holiness or prayer can be portrayed on screen, for instance, and any thoughts that you might offer to would-be Catholic filmmakers.
I think the question of the saint film really touches the more global point of the cinematographic biography, the attempt to portray a life in cinema, and that is always difficult because, for one thing, a life is long and a film is short. So how can you expect to conjure up a lifetime in an hour and a half or 2 hours and a half if you have a patient audience? So that, I think, is just one very banal factor. When you're dealing with saints' lives, you have the added challenge of trying to convey not just the complexity of human existence, but of a supernatural inspiration. And I think in order to have any chance of conveying that, you need somehow to have been there. We see the same in written biographies, or we see them in portraiture. That there must be some deep affinity. And that affinity doesn't necessarily mean that you're a saint yourself, or that you've had the same sort of experiences, but that you've touched some of the same depths. And therefore, I think it's a wonderful and it's a delightful, and to me, a continuously mysterious fact that the greatest saint film I can think of, which is a film about the greatest saint of all, is Pasolini's St. Matthew's Gospel.
Wow.
And Pasolini was certainly not a saint.
Yeah.
But he was someone who knew the pain of life and who knew the earnestness of life, and who knew the thirst for love and truth. And his, the sheer guts he had in picking up the gospel and saying, I'll put this on the screen, and the anxieties that caused in the Catholic community, where many were convinced that he would produce something blasphemous.
Yep.
And then this pellucid, pristine, clear, sharp profile appears, dedicated to the Pope, and then crowned by all sorts of Catholic awards. But I think it says something about, the depth calling out to depth factor, which has got to be there first before you try to dabble in the making of the life of a saint.
Are there any other saint films that you find to be outstanding examples of the genre?
I can't say I've seen all that many outstanding ones.
Me neither.
I did watch a few years ago a film about Bakita that I thought was quite good. I did quite enjoy the first of the two films, which were launched just under the title Karol, about John Paul II.
Right.
But I'm aware that those films take extraordinary liberties with historical truths and are not particularly reliable. Sort of in their documentary dimension. Still, I found that there is a portrayal that in the first film, there is a portrayal of a vocational maturing that seemed to me quite convincing. But no, I can't think of all that many good examples, actually.
Well, perhaps, I'll be honest, Your Excellency, the first time I saw the Gospel according to Matthew, I was a bit underwhelmed. I didn't respond very favorably to it at the time, so I haven't returned to it. It being the final weeks of Lent, this may be a good time for those who are interested to take another look at that film. Do you have any comments that might help someone approaching that film for the first time, or someone like me who wants to approach it with a view toward appreciating it more deeply?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that my experience is like yours. The first time I watched it, I left the cinema. I thought, oh, what was the point of that?
Yeah.
And yet I found that as time passed, there were scenes in that film that remained with me, iconic scenes. And I realized that it really had a contemplative dimension, and it had enabled me to see certain aspects of the gospel story in a new light. And then I returned to it and I watched it again and again and again. And then I realized that it's based on a twin process of estrangement and immediacy, because in some ways it's a bit like a Greek play, that it's not a realistic film. The scenes are obviously staged.
Right.
And there is a performance going on, and there are discourses being proclaimed. And at the same time, there is this deep human credibility, and the fact that Pasolini largely made it just with his friends, with his mother as the Virgin Mary, and members of his family, created. I mean, I can't imagine quite what the atmosphere must have been among the cast.
Yeah.
But I found also that it stands for a kind of a dispassionate and a realistic reading of the gospel narrative. One thing that provoked me when I first watched it, and that I thought objectionable, was the fact that Jesus is constantly presented as being in a hurry. He walks extremely fast. He speaks extremely fast, like an Italian, machine gun actor. But then, because we hear the gospel read at Mass in these digestible units and short snippets, and we think about them hard, and we try to have devout sentiments about them. But when you read the Gospels, you find that there is a lot of reference to swift movement. And he had so much to convey that was so essential, and he knew that the time was short. And I think something that Pasolini manages to convey in that film is the urgency of the message and the urgency of response, because you haven't got much time. He's here now, he's talking, he's calling, and then he'll be off. What will you do? Will you stay or will you follow? And that, to my mind, is something that corresponds deeply to the evangelical message.
I remember when we discussed the film that James had noted the scenes early on where we just see Jesus like walking through a field, walking past someone, not even stopping, but just saying, repent and believe in the gospel as he walks by, not even stopping, and that is quite striking.
Yeah.
You gave this talk on translation as the Erasmus lecture for First Things recently, and you were talking about your experiences with different languages, literature. I wanted to ask about this in the case of cinema. Is there a sense in which cinema doesn't need to be translated because it's such a visual medium? And also, more broadly, this is a very leading question here, but why should American Catholics consider watching more foreign films?
Because they're good. Some of them, anyway.
Yeah.
there is potentially a kind of universalism to the cinema. You can watch the Apu trilogy set in rural India, in a world that is culturally eons away, and yet be utterly absorbed by it, provided you have some sense of what the dialogue means. But sometimes that's not even necessary.
Right.
But at the same time, obviously, cinema is conditioned by particular and local sensibilities the way any art form is. And I'm by no means an expert on this, and I've never been a very systematic cinema goer. So I've never watched everything that a particular director or producer has made, or spent months watching films coming out of a particular country. But I always find it interesting to watch films that may have been recommended to me from different cultural contexts, alert to both similarities and contrasts. And I think, again, as with other art forms, but perhaps in a particularly intense way, one of the blessings of encountering great art is precisely that it confronts us in a non-menacing way with what is foreign to us, not just in the sense that it's from a foreign country, but with different sensibilities, different temperaments, different perspectives, and thereby, potentially our own capacity for seeing and even for empathy can be enhanced, and that, to my mind, is a good thing.
Mm. I wanted to open it up very generally for you to talk about what are some of your favorite films. I mean, you mentioned The Sacrifice, you mentioned The Gospel According to Matthew, but can you talk about any other films that have had a significant impact on you?
I mean, there are so many, and not all of them are Russian and full of existential. I mean, I love The Sound of Music.
Great, my children do too.
Yes. And a few years ago, I watched the Bourne films with great interest.
The Jason Bourne films.
Yes, the Jason Bourne films.
And what did you think about the use of violence in those films, if I may ask?
I thought that was an aspect that I find, particularly in the wake of my monastic experience, I find I just can't take violence very well. So I would occasionally close my eyes. But I thought what was interesting in those films was the way in which they engage with the question of identity. Who am I, and how can I know who I am? Other films, a film I've been thinking about a lot recently is The Madness of King George, based on a play by Alan Bennett and made by Nicholas Heitner.
I'm not familiar with this film.
In the 90s, I think, about King George V, who, as King of England, went through a sort of breakdown and was declared mad. And there were issues arising of dynastic succession, etc. Mm-hmm. So that is portrayed in the film, but what is really portrayed, and based on Alan Bennett's brilliant play, is the inner soul crisis of this king, who is aware of being not just an individual in pain and a crisis, but being the symbolic figurehead and in some ways the embodiment of a nation.
Wow.
And that's a fantastic film. A film which I believe must be cited in some ways implicit in Nanni Moretti's Habemus Papam, about a papal election, and about someone being elected pope who just can't bear the burden of the election and goes into a soul-searching crisis. Nanni Moretti's film was launched while I was living in Rome, and it was more or less made to coincide with either the beatification or the canonization of Sir John Paul II. And again, various media were very skeptical and said, "Oh, this is just going to be a grotesque attack on the church, etc." But I didn't find it that at all. It's a humorous film, and it really does make you laugh. And sometimes it goes a bit far in what it draws on for humor, but it is reflective and humane, and I think intelligent, and touching that issue of what it is to deal with a deep soul crisis when you are at the same time entrusted with an unimaginable responsibility. Another film that I love, which is a totally different kind, is a film by Raul Ruiz, The Mistress of Lisbon, a Portuguese film, about 10, 15 years old, which is, that too plays on that point of intersection between the realistic in cinema and the conscious artificiality of the theatre.
Right.
And then, I mean, many films by Ingmar Bergman,
of course,
who is probably, if I were to name a favorite director, it would be him. Some of his films are extremely hard to watch, and some of them, like Persona, that I watched in the cinema in Paris when I was there doing research 25 years ago. I'm not sure I'd have the courage to watch again.
Any favorites by Bergman?
Well, I mean, Fanny and Alexandra, I think. I think it's just extraordinary. And then I love the Autumn Sonata. That's another very, very difficult film to watch. But the acting in that film is exceptional. And what it says about parenthood, filiation, the relationship between a mother and a daughter, between the demands of art and the demands of family, vocational responsibility, maternal, paternal responsibility, all that's very, very powerful. And then my favorite of all is The Magic Flute, that production which he made for television, which has, I don't know, in the midst of all of Bergman's existentialism and bleakness, there is in The Magic Flute a lightness and a delight and a sense of humor and color and an innocence that I think is somehow always there, also in his other films. But he simply permitted himself in the making of The Magic Flute to make all those things explicit. So when if I feel discouraged or I'm down in the dumps, then I may even watch half an hour of Bergman's Magic Flute, and I'm right again.
That's wonderful. Yeah, we're always looking for recommendations of what films to cover next on the podcast, and there were a few of those that you mentioned that I've not seen nor even heard of. Not the Bergman films, but this Portuguese film you mentioned and a couple of the other ones, so that's very exciting.
If you don't mind, I'd like to name a few directors, and if you don't have any thoughts on them, that's fine. But just to see some directors who are sort of interest to Catholic viewers, to see if you have any thoughts on them. You mentioned Tarkovsky. Do you have anything more to say about Tarkovsky?
I mean, one could talk about him for hours.
Yeah,
right. I haven't seen everything, but the Sacrifice I've seen many times. I know that film well, and Ivan Rubliov I've seen many times. I know that film well as well, and that's I find a film that I need to watch again every 2 or 3 years or so.
You're talking about Andrei Rublev?
Yes, I've seen Nostalgia and Solaris that impressed me and that I feel I should watch again, but I just haven't sort of had the energy to watch again. But The Sacrifice in particular is one of those films that just keeps living within you, I find.
What about the American director Terrence Malick?
Again, I haven't seen everything. The first film by Malick that I watched was Thin Red Line.
Yep.
that I thought was extraordinary. I just wasn't prepared for it, because when I watched it, I'd heard the name, but I hadn't got too precise ideas of who he was and the sort of work he was doing. I watched A Hidden Life, which cinematographically is wonderful and very powerful. I wasn't entirely convinced by the characters. And I felt, when you read the correspondence of the Jägerstätters, there is, they were both, as far as I remember, tertiary Franciscans, and
right,
and there is an explicit devotion, and even a kind of a Baroque devotion that was, it seems to me, fundamental to who they were and to the relationship they formed. And I felt that got a little bit lost in the Sturm und Drang of their intense love for one another, which certainly is true as well. But I felt there was something sort of humanly, potentially supernaturally missing. And I wasn't. And Jägerstätter dies at the end as a martyr to his conscience, but does he die as a martyr to his faith? That was a question I was left with at the end.
Yes.
But
I think that's right.
It's a really beautiful film.
Yeah, we had many of the same questions when we discussed the film on the podcast.
Yep. Have you seen The Tree of Life?
I've seen half of it, because it was being shown at the house I was living in Rome when I was there, and I walked into it. And I was sort of mesmerized by it. And I've been waiting for the right moment to watch it undiluted and whole, and it's good that you remind me of it. I should do that.
Yeah, it's my favorite film.
And you mentioned Kieślowski before, the Polish director?
Yes. I admire him. I mean, obviously, there are the three colors, red, white, and blue. And I think that's a remarkable trilogy. Mm-hmm. There's another film, The Double Life of Veronique.
Yes.
That I've watched several times. And I remember I once came across on late night television, that was, to reassure you, that was before I entered the monastery, a documentary about Kieślowski and a conversation with him. And I've been trying to find that documentary ever since without success. But I remember him saying that after he'd made The Double Life of Veronique, and it had been showing in cinemas across the world for a few months, he'd got a letter from a young woman who had simply said, "Thank you for making that film. Watching it made me realize that I have a soul."
Wow.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And I can't think of any higher compliment to make to an artist than that.
Amen.
And then obviously there's his extraordinary series on the Ten Commandments.
Yep.
That I have watched integrally, and some of those I watched several times.
Right.
But Kieślowski is one of those other directors able to touch through cinema both the deeply human and the transcendent and numinous.
Any parting words to Catholic filmmakers out there, and anything you'd like to say to them?
Just keep at it, and remember your responsibility, because potentially you can help people come to the realization that they have a soul.
Indeed. Well, Bishop Erik Varden, we're so grateful that you came on our tiny little podcast straight after preaching to the Pope. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me. All the best.
All right. God bless you.
And you.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.